So good afternoon and welcome again to the CERIAS seminar. Our speaker today is the person here at Purdue who's had the longest experience with CERIAS other than myself and Marlene Walls, who works with me. Pascal Meunier has been associated with the center for pretty much its entire lifetime. Before it started in the Coast Laboratory, he was involved as a graduate student studying and was one of the first hires into the center as a research scientist. And he's been working with the center ever since. He demonstrates some of the ability of people in other disciplines to gain keen insight into things that go on in computing, having a background not really in computing, but in biophysics, biochemistry, and biology. His PhD is in biophysics. But along a path, which I don't think he'll describe in the talk today, he ended up here at Purdue taking some graduate courses in computing and got enamored of some of the issues in information security and became a full-time passion for him. He's headed up a number of projects through the center over the years. One of the things that he's gotten involved in was where we were trying to establish a more scientific basis for understanding vulnerabilities in software. And he has become one of the more notable members of a collaborative effort that has gone on for many years, spearheaded through MITRE Corporation, to identify and classify vulnerabilities and weaknesses. He's going to talk about part of that today, although there's much, much more he could talk about in the topic area. But I don't want to take any more of his time, so please join me in welcoming Dr. Meunier.
Thank you. All right, so I'll be talking about the common weakness enumeration, which is, as Pef mentioned, directed by MITRE. It's a joint effort with science and security vendors as well. So this is the plan of the talk. I will describe what the common weakness enumeration is. I'll then talk about the top 25. And then I'll move on to what's different in 2010 about the top 25 list. So we'll talk about profiles, we'll talk about mitigations, the metrics we used, guidance, and just to give you an idea of how much effort has gone into this 2010 version, the PDF version of the document is twice the size that it was last year. All right, so the CWE, or the Common Weakness Enumeration, is a unified, measurable set of software weaknesses. For every weakness, we give it an identifier that has the form CWE dash and a number. So the goal is that you can discuss every issue you find in terms of a specific CWE ID. For example, if you run a code scanner, the code scanner can report what it finds with CWE IDs, and then that gives you a reference if you want to find out more about what this type of weakness is and how to mitigate it. You can go look up additional resources. So in the CWE, you have flaws, you have coding errors, you have failures to use mitigations, failure to apply secure programming principles. So in essence, it's an attempt at recording everything that people can do wrong and everything that can go wrong. So it's a blacklist. It's also job security, because as a blacklist, people will always find something new to do incorrectly, or new ways to do things incorrectly. So here's an example of an entry in the CWE. Missing encryption of sensitive data, number 311. So the idea is that you should protect sensitive data when it's in storage or when it's in transit. So the idea is to protect against threats such as packet sniffing, getting your computer stolen, or someone having unauthorized access to read those files. If it's encrypted, it's not going to be much use to them. So I'd like to ask you if you can think of a case where this CWE applies. An example. I'd like to engage you and get you to participate in this talk.
Recent thing with the video downlink on the Predators.
The what, pardon me?
They found that with like home equipment, they could receive the video downlink unencrypted off the Predator.
Yes, the drones, right? Yes. So the answer that the gentleman said was that there are some drones used by the army in Afghanistan, for example, that transmit video unencrypted so that, I mean, as a consequence of that, insurgents can look at the video and figure out what's happening and also get more information than they would have otherwise. Here are some other examples. Backups. If you make backups of computers, you'd like your backups to be encrypted when you send them to a storage facility, or if you're sending them on the net to a company, right? There are these companies that allow you to do net backups. So you'd like all that you send to be encrypted. If you store social security numbers or credit card numbers in a database, then you'd like to encrypt those as well in case someone gets access to the database or to the database files. For example, there's standard for the payment card industry, and people demand compliance for it, so it's PCI compliance, and you're supposed to encrypt credit card numbers. You may also want to encrypt your home partition on if you have Unix type operating system or Linux. If you use an application or if you log in over a network, you'd like that to be encrypted while it's in transit. So keep that in mind. I'll ask you a question about this later. So the CWE forms a graph, a hierarchical graph. It goes from very generic issues, and then it spreads out to the more specific ones. It's not, anyway, it's not a pure tree because an entry can have several parents. Okay, entries can also make chains. You can define that before you can use a specific weakness, there has to be another weakness present. For example, there may be in a specific piece of software a buffer overflow that can be exploited only if there's another flaw that allows an integer overflow. An entry may also require other conditions to be present, and then it's called a composite. For example, the CSRF vulnerability. So that's the cross-site request forgery. It's a web development flaw. All right, so the thing is that we have about 800 of those CWEs. And people would like to ask, well, what should we be most concerned about, and what are the hottest weaknesses right now in software? If we conduct an audit, what should we look for? What is most likely to give us the greatest return for our efforts? So this top 25 list gives the most widespread and critical programming errors. So I'll ask you to guess, how many ways do you think there are to overflow a buffer? A, 2 or 3, B, 4 or 5, C, 6 to 12, D, 13 to 25, or E, 50 ways. Okay, it's not E. But well, anybody venture a guess? Pardon me? D? C. Yes. Well, or so I think. It depends on how you count. Because there's this thing called level of abstraction. As I described, it's a hierarchical graph going into more and more details as you go down. So depending on how deep you go, you may get a different count of ways to get something bad to happen. So in this case, if you count the lowest, if you count the leaves, then you should get 8 or 9. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Right. And guess what? There are 2 more that we created while making the top 25 list that are not shown in this graph. So you can think about the operation type you're doing, reading versus writing. You can think about the data structure that's involved. Maybe it's an array, maybe it's a string. Maybe you're not checking for the size. Maybe the size of the buffer that you need is not calculated correctly. So there are many aspects from which you can look at a weakness. So the level of abstraction matters. There can be so many ways for some types of weaknesses that it's hard to remember them all. So the idea this year was, we said, if we list things that are very high level, people will think that they have covered all the more specific forms of the weakness, but there's a risk that they'll forget 1 or 2. So in 2010, we used lower level CWEs in the top 25 list. So for example, instead of just stating generic buffer overflow, we'll use CWE 131, which says that you use an incorrect calculation for the buffer size. We also wanted to avoid something that could happen that is having both a parent and a child in the list. So it happened, we noticed that there were some entries that we were forced to include on the list because we didn't have a lower level CWE. So we created more CWEs to provide a consistent level of abstraction in the list. Another thing we did, because we're using lower level, we need more space. Okay? So we took some general good practices that were very high level, but instead of removing them from the list, we created a special section called mitigations. For example, last year we had this CWE 20, improper input validation. Right? Everybody knows they should do input validation, or we hope anyway at this point. So that's being moved to the mitigation list. It's a first mitigation established